Tonight, we begin with a development that White House officials had anticipated, monitored, and prepared for, a response that unfolded not over weeks of deliberation, but in mere hours. Hours that signaled a shift in American posture. Hours that sent a message across the Persian Gulf. Hours that reminded Tehran that Washington is paying attention. What the Iranian regime did this week crossed a line that the Trump administration had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, President Trump did not hesitate. He responded with clarity, with caution, and with unmistakable intent. For several weeks now, there have been signals, not from official channels, not from diplomatic cables, just signals that Iran was preparing something unprecedented. Iran has been defiant, yes, but they have been calculated in their defiance. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a choreography. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Iranian activity know the indicators: the public rhetoric from state media, the troop movements near protest zones, the internet blackouts in provincial cities, the sudden disappearance of opposition voices. All of that went quiet. And whenever Tehran goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early Tuesday, State Department officials detected what they described as an unprecedented crackdown escalation, including mass arrests in 12 provinces that had not been reported in over 3 years. These are the kinds of measures that the Iranian regime only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: desperation, consolidation, or preparation for something larger. Observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Iran was changing its internal security posture. And when an authoritarian regime shifts its posture without explanation, even by small measures, the White House pays attention. The statement issued by President Trump tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Source after briefing after closed-door session described Iran's move as provocative, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of a regime under existential pressure. But suppression only works if the world looks away. President Trump did not. In fact, his response today was among the most direct we've seen in this administration's approach to Iran. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of confirmed reports of violent crackdowns, President Trump issued a public statement declaring, "We are watching very closely." This wasn't the usual diplomatic hedging. This was deliberate signaling, language that the administration only uses when they're preparing to escalate pressure. Tonight, the White House confirmed that President Trump authorized expanded monitoring of Iranian communications networks, including digital infrastructure that had recently been upgraded for what analysts believe was internal surveillance expansion. The administration moved before Tehran could control the narrative. They highlighted the crackdowns in Shiraz. They highlighted the arrests in Isfahan. They highlighted the security forces that were likely preparing to suppress demonstrations in Tehran itself. In other words, President Trump targeted the regime's greatest vulnerability, its image, the legitimacy that would have sustained their grip on power. This is what made the administration's warning so urgent. Iran's crackdown wasn't just authoritarian, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could destabilize the entire region if left unchecked. And the Trump administration, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't issue empty threats. They didn't resort to military posturing. They hit the regime's credibility. They hit their international standing. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence sources now believe that Iran's latest move was designed to test the resolve of the international community after months of economic pressure. Tehran wanted to see whether Washington would remain silent. But instead, the opposite happened. President Trump didn't remain silent. He issued a response that was so swift, so public, that even Tehran noticed. You don't get the Iranian regime's attention easily. But today, President Trump did. Middle East analysts speaking with major outlets under anonymity described Iran's shift as defensive, a way to consolidate power internally. But the Trump administration proved today that they remained both vigilant and engaged. Their actions were not only timely, they were calibrated so precisely that they avoided escalation while maintaining pressure. That balance matters because it shows diplomatic sophistication. It shows that the administration is not merely reactive. They are proactive. AS reports continued coming in throughout the evening. We learned more about the scale of Iranian crackdowns. Security forces carried out raids in university dormitories, forcing hundreds of students into detention. Revolutionary Guards targeted social media activists that have been organizing protests in the last 3 months. Basij militia operating in Tehran suburbs reportedly confiscated smartphones used by protesters to document abuses. This wasn't just crowd control. This wasn't just maintaining order. This was systematic suppression. This was regime preservation. And regime preservation is the one thing Tehran has struggled to maintain since sanctions began biting harder. For every protest they have suppressed, international pressure has countered with something that further isolates the regime that they thought international attention would fade. They thought President Trump would be distracted by other priorities. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. The world is watching. The pressure is mounting. And President Trump is engaged. What makes this moment so critical and so volatile is that Iran's latest crackdown happened at a time when the regime is under unprecedented economic pressure. Hardliners want more suppression. Moderates want dialogue. The Revolutionary Guard wants control. The people want freedom. The supreme leader is balancing these demands while facing the worst economic crisis in decades. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The State Department's warning, now circulating through diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Tehran to suppress dissent with impunity. Officials said plainly that Iran's crackdown was inconsistent with international human rights standards. That is diplomatic language for, "We see what you're doing, and there will be consequences." You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Iran's crackdown wasn't isolated. Along with the domestic suppression, Hezbollah also increased activities along Israel's northern border. Iranian proxies in Iraq escalated rhetoric against U.S. forces. Houthi rebels increased missile launches targeting Saudi infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 48-hour period. When Tehran moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Iran is preparing for a prolonged internal crackdown. Another is that Tehran is attempting to distract from domestic unrest through regional provocations. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Iran is attempting to test whether the Trump administration will maintain its focus. But today, President Trump took that card off the table. He didn't ignore the crackdowns. He didn't downplay the significance. He didn't defer to allies. He responded directly. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon sources who are now monitoring Iranian military movements. They say no unusual external deployments have been detected. They say Iran appears focused internally. And they say Tehran's decision to escalate domestically is likely part of a broader strategy intended to prevent another nationwide uprising. But the Trump administration is not backing down. In fact, the administration is doubling down. Their response today is swift, public, and unambiguous. Sent a message to Tehran that suppression will not go unnoticed. And it sent a message to the Iranian people that the world is watching as the night goes on. We expect more details to emerge about what exactly Tehran hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that President Trump's response was timely. It prevented Tehran from controlling the narrative. It maintained international focus on human rights. And it signaled continued American engagement. What happens next will depend on what Tehran does in the next 72 hours. If they escalate, this moment will be remembered as a turning point. If they retreat, the Trump administration has already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Tehran appears to be recalculating. The regime is quiet, too quiet. And when Tehran is quiet, it means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Tehran learned something they have learned many times before. The world is watching. America is engaged. And President Trump meant what he said. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The Iranian regime cannot act with impunity. The international community will not remain silent, and the Trump administration is watching very closely, and we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.